Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So at Texas A&M, we say howdy instead of hello. So I say howdy. And it's always disappointing to say it when I speak around the country, because when I say it at Texas A&M, 250 students in my class simultaneously yell howdy back. And it's actually very impressive. And it's also a neat teaching tool because it's a great way to get everyone refocused when you say howdy. So it's wonderful to be here. Greetings from Texas. Thank you so much, Rob, and everyone for inviting me. I'm truly delighted to be here. And I hope that I can keep you awake after your lunch. Hopefully you had coffee as well. So in the fall of 1864, the people of the Carolinas experienced something that they likened to a plague. One local South Carolina newspaper put it this way: they seem to be everywhere. They literally cover the land like the locusts of Egypt. The paper was talking about thousands of Yankees sneaking across the South Carolina countryside at night, breaking into barns, digging up sweet potatoes out of farmers' fields. Enslaved people hid, fed, and guided these Yankees as they moved across the countryside. One minister went out to his barn and found a Yankee taking a nap under his fodder. The Yankee woke up, attacked the minister. After kind of a scuffle, the minister subdued the Yankee and then took him at gunpoint to the local jail. There was a woman who was out squirrel hunting, and she found a Yankee hiding behind a tree, and she used the gun that she was using to hunt squirrels to take this Yankee back to her local jail. So the Yankees who were disturbing the peace inside the Carolina countryside, these were not armed soldiers marching with William Tecumseh Sherman on his campaign. They were unarmed and hungry and desperate escaped prisoners of war. And interestingly, there were more than 3,000 of them on the loose in the Carolinas in the last winter of the American Civil War. Where did all of these escaped prisoners come from? And what does their story tell us about the soldiers' Civil War? So that's what I'm hoping to answer for you this afternoon. So here's where they came from. The story begins, all right, I am pressing what I thought was forward. That's what I'm hitting. In this dramatic pause, you can be picturing to yourself the thousands of Yankees and the anticipation. Where did they come from? It's building, it's building. So the story begins when desperate Confederate officials in Richmond tried to shift most of their prisoner of war population out of Georgia after Sherman captured Atlanta on September 2nd, 1864. They didn't want Sherman to be able to recover these Yankee prisoners who were held in Andersonville and Macon. So Confederate authorities in Richmond send telegrams to Georgia: evacuate the officers, the Union officers that are being held in Macon, and evacuate the Union enlisted men that are being held in Andersonville prison. But the problem was there weren't adequate shelters prepared anywhere else in the region to house 33,000 hungry and ill-clad Union prisoners of war. And there was no commissary general of prisoners in the Confederacy in September 1864, but rather there was divided responsibility between General John Winder and General William Gardner, neither of whom was entirely clear about the lines of his own authority. And I kind of feel for William Gardner, who truly in his correspondence, he doesn't know what prisons he's in charge of. He doesn't know where his responsibilities are. And that kind of confusion goes down in history that we don't even have a verifiable photograph of him. So it was that confused for him. So John Winder is in charge of the evacuation, and he decided to send the prisoners to Savannah and Charleston. So Gardner notified Major General Sam Jones, who's commander of the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and he telegraphed him, "I've got prisoners on the way to you from Andersonville and Macon, and I'm sending them to you." Jones, of course, thought to himself, "I am trying to defend the entire coastline, Charleston and Savannah, from an active and ongoing Union operations. I cannot defend the coast and guard 33,000 prisoners of war. Are you kidding me? Especially when you're telling me that they're going to get here in 2 days." So Jones is going to scramble to try to find guards for all of these prisoners that are being sent to him. So he contacted Brigadier General James Chestnut Jr., who was commander of the Confederate Reserves in South Carolina. So the Confederate Reserves at this point in the war are young boys between the ages of 17 and 18, and men between the ages of 45 and 55, who are put on reserve, and then if necessary, the 17-year-olds, when they turn 18, they'll go into the Confederate Army, but they can be called up for specific purposes within the Confederate military effort. So Chestnut is in charge of the Confederate Reserves. And he says, "Okay, I don't have enough reserves to guard these prisoners, but what I'll do is I'll just call up the citizens of South Carolina and ask them to guard the prisoners." And then he telegraphed Samuel Jones, "I couldn't get anybody to come, so I'm not going to be able to take charge of these prisoners at present." So Jones is completely discombobulated when the first 10,000 enlisted prisoners and 1,400 Union officers show up in Charleston. He again telegraphs to Richmond, protesting furiously, "I can't do ongoing military operations and guard these prisoners." And then he gets a message that yellow fever has broken out in Charleston. And he says, "That's it." So without notifying anyone in Richmond or telling anyone about what he's going to do, he sends the enlisted men out of Charleston by train and just sends them to this little community of Florence, South Carolina. So on the map, it's here, so you can picture, if you look at the map, the train from Charleston up to Florence. He sends the federal enlisted men to Florence. The men are turned out in an open field. No fences, no buildings, just an open field, with a force of 125 men to guard them. So these Union prisoners of war who were veterans of a summer in Andersonville, they're not really interested in going into another Confederate prison, so they mutiny when they get to Florence. And they try to flee the area before a stockade can be constructed. So more than 400 of them broke loose from the guards, plundered the citizens in the vicinity of the camp for food and clothing, and attempted to destroy the railroad to Charleston. So when the commander of the Confederate Guard telegraphed to Charleston that his force was completely overpowered and that the railroad might be destroyed, Jones immediately deployed an artillery unit, a cavalry unit, and every infantryman that he could spare from Charleston and sent them to Florence. And then they put an appeal in the newspaper to the citizens of Florence to be on the lookout for escaped prisoners and to detain them. So over the next several days, this military force that Jones had sent from Charleston and local citizens patrolled the area and rounded up all but 23 of those escaped prisoners. So despite the temporary influx of troops from Charleston, Confederate officers in Florence had to resort to mobilizing the entire local population in order to restore order and assert authority over the prisoners. In the meantime, the enslaved people are hastily constructing a stockade at Florence. And finally, although it's not complete, it's ready enough to receive prisoners. And so on September 30th, about 12,000 Union prisoners of war are put into a stockade in Florence. And what I find is interesting is citizens from around the area of Florence turned out on the morning of September 30th with their weapons, with arms, and surrounded the stockade and were there to help the military put the prisoners into the stockade. So Jones's precipitous creation of a site at Florence only partially handled the prisoner of war problem because he still had 1,500 Union officer prisoners of war in the city. So what he did was on October 5th and October 6th, he sent them by train to Columbia, the capital of South Carolina. 100 of these officers escaped in Charleston as they were marched down the street to the railroad station. Another 100 jumped off the train when it stopped at a water tank near Branchville. So you can see Branchville on the map between Charleston and Columbia. So another 100 jump off the train at Branchville, or they leap from the cars when it's kind of moving more slowly as it stops to get water. So the Federals who don't escape from the train arrive in Columbia in 2 shifts on October 5th and 6th, 1864, just one day after Jefferson Davis gave a speech in Columbia encouraging South Carolinians to give their all for the Confederacy. So the guards turned these prisoners out, here we go again, into an open field with no stockade, no buildings, and a bunch of 16 and 17-year-old boys and 55-year-old men to guard them. A month of fruitless wrangling between authorities in Richmond and officials on the ground in South Carolina about, is this going to be a prison? Do we need to send them somewhere else? Left these 1,400, 1,300, 1,200 as more and more escape. There's less and less of them in this open field without adequate shelter, without adequate food, for weeks. And so they're going to take advantage of that time to escape from this open field, which was called Camp Sorghum, even though it was just an open field. So eventually, 500 officers will escape from Camp Sorghum. A lot of them don't leave because, it's kind of scary to go into the middle of the Confederacy, try to work your way back to Union lines. A lot of them are sick. But those who do escape, 65% of them eventually return to Union lines. So fugitives from the train who are officers or who escape from Camp Sorghum, they're going to follow one of 3 routes to try to get back to Union Army lines. So I have this again kind of indicated for you on the map. You see Columbia in the center of South Carolina. So there will be some Union escaped officers who decide to try to use the river systems of South Carolina and try to get to the coast, where there's a Union blockade and where Union troops control the South Carolina Sea Islands, Hilton Head, they're at Morris Island, and places like that. Some of them say, okay, let's try to get to Georgia because maybe we can hook up with Sherman's army that's operating in the region. So you can see some of them are going to head towards Augusta and try to get to Georgia. Others are going to decide to walk to Knoxville, Tennessee, because they believe that there are Unionists in western North Carolina that might help them. And they think that even though it's a longer distance to walk, we might actually get some support if we go in that direction. So those are the 3 different routes that these escaped prisoners are going to take. So I enjoyed preparing for this talk because my book is really about what was going on internally in the Confederacy, what the journey of these escaped prisoners tell us about the collapse of the Confederacy at the end of the war. But I had an opportunity for this talk to reflect a little bit more on what does this tell me about these escaped prisoners as soldiers, and what qualities they developed and what they had to do to be able to manage and survive this prison experience and then this escape from Confederate prison. So I want to kind of organize how I tell their story based on the reflection that I did just over the last few days, thinking about the Soldiers' War and what this journey told me about that. It gave me insight into their qualities of survival. So here's the first one, I think, represented by John V. Hadley, who was an escaped prisoner from the 7th Indiana. The Union soldiers who survived their escape journey applied the lessons they had learned from the Army about organization and discipline. They were veterans who believed that even on a journey of escape, they should apply Army discipline to what they were trying to accomplish. So John V. Hadley and Lieutenant Homer Chisman were both of the 7th Indiana. They actually escaped from Camp Sorghum. And in the woods outside the camp, They linked up with a soldier from the 6th Missouri and the 1st Maryland Cavalry. So one of the things that I found is that in all of these escape parties, they usually traveled in groups of 2 to 4 men. So here we have 4 men. But on the first night of their journey, they quarreled over their destination. Chisholm wanted to go to Knoxville, which would mean 260 miles of walking and crossing the Appalachian Mountains in winter. But as I mentioned earlier, they might find Union supporters in the mountains. Hadley and the other 2 men wanted to strike towards the railroad between Chattanooga and Atlanta. It was a shorter distance to travel, and they assumed that few Confederate troops were posted along the route. So the quarrel actually reminded them that any successful military undertaking required discipline. So they stopped, and they immediately adopted a set of field regulations to govern their journey. And what I think is really interesting about this is it's remarkably similar to the other field regulations that other parties of escaped prisoners developed. And we know about this because these guys kept diaries, and then they had to report what they saw when they returned to Union lines. The provost marshals interviewed them, and so they talked about their experience when they returned to Union lines. So here was the field regulations for Hadley and his party. Every 24 hours, starting at 9 p.m. that first night, they would rotate command of the expedition. The commander made all the decisions on behalf of the escape party. They would travel at night on the roads and never speak above a whisper. They would march in a single file line at intervals of 3 paces. The first person would be in charge of scanning the area in front of him. The second person would scan to the right. The third person would scan to the left, and the person in the rear would kind of keep an eye on what was happening behind them. At any sign of danger, they would hiss, and the entire party would jump off the road and hide. With that discipline in place, they moved in a westward direction, hoping that the next 24 hours would enable them to come up with a unanimous vote that they agreed would be necessary to determine the objective of their journey. Because what they decided is where we're going to go is so important, we'll have to have a unanimous vote, and then after that, whoever's the commander will make all the decisions for that 24 hours, and we'll agree to follow that. Okay, so we'll come back to it where they decide what they're going to do. So hold on. There's a way they're going to end up making the decision of where to go. So second, Union soldiers traveling through the Carolina landscape had to be close observers of landscapes, people, and interactions that challenged their preconceived ideas about white and black Southerners. They had to be flexible and adaptable. And I think that their interactions with enslaved people show both their ability to adapt their ideas and the limits to their ability to adapt. So one of the things that I think is so useful about studying these escaped prisoners, they're not like other Union soldiers. They are not coming into the South as part of an invading army that's armed, that's, with 20,000 other guys. They are unarmed, they're vulnerable, they're alone in a party of 4 other men, and they have to absolutely rely on Southern people that they run into to save their lives. So because of this, they notice things that other Union soldiers don't notice. And I find that very interesting to follow what they notice. So let's look at the example of Lieutenant Willard Worcester Glazier, who was from New York's Harris Light Cavalry. And he was traveling with Moses W. Lemon, who was also from New York. He was with the 14th New York Heavy Artillery. I love Glazier because his sense of direction is terrible. He always gets good directions from people, but he's perennially lost. I mean, his diary is just lost. I'm lost. I'm constantly lost. But he and Lemon had one plan in mind for success, and that was to seek help from black people and avoid all white men. So they're like, if we're going to get out of this, that's what we have to do. So they counted on getting food and directions from enslaved people as they moved towards Augusta, because their plan was to go to Augusta. But they immediately encountered a fatal flaw in their plan. As they walked on the road from Columbia to Lexington, they heard some people speaking behind them. And they realized that in the dark, they couldn't tell the difference between a white person and a black person. So they had expected black Southerners to talk in the stereotypical minstrel dialects that they'd heard in the minstrel shows that they'd gone to in New York. And instead, when they get to South Carolina, they realize that black people and white people sound the same. Now, this is interesting. I had to do some research on dialects and speech when I was writing this book. And what I learned is that linguists believe that in the 18th and 19th century, regional dialects in the South actually varied even more than they do today, and that within regions, black and white Southerners did speak with more similar accents and more similar vernaculars than is actually the case in the 20th and 21st century. So what Glaser heard is actually accurate. An outsider would have had a very hard time telling in the dark the race of the person that was speaking. So they continue on and they see some cabins that they think are their stereotype of what a slave cabin should look like. But when they get closer and they hear the voices inside, again, they're not sure what that is. So Glaser actually goes to the window of this building and yells in the window, "Are you white or black in there?" Okay. So this right away penetrates through pre-war assumptions that Glaser had about the South. It's not what he thought, and navigating it is different than he thought. So once escaped Union prisoners actually do make contact with black Southerners, they have other assumptions to adjust. Oh, didn't want to go there yet. So let's go back to John Hadley, that Indianian, if that's how you say Indianian. So his party is still not sure of the route of their escape, but they develop a system to contact enslaved people. Every night at 10 o'clock, they approach what they think are slave quarters. Two men would stop 100 yards away, one man would stop 50 yards away, and then one man, whoever was the commander for that 24 hours, would go to the door and knock on the door. And they memorized a speech that they would give when the door was opened. And here was their speech. "I'm a Yankee, just escaped from a rebel prison. I have 3 companions nearby, and we are all nearly starved. Our only hope is your aid. There are no friends with white skins for us here. Your race caused this war and brought this calamity upon us. It is as much for your good as ours if you help us. Can you give us something, only what you can spare and nothing more?" Now, it's really hard to imagine an enslaved person being enthusiastic about this speech and saying, "Yes, I really want to help this person." But yet they always received aid, and I'll get back to why in a little bit. After receiving whatever help the enslaved person offered, the Federals then asked the name of a black person they could contact who lived at least 15 miles ahead on the road. Other Federals likewise implemented systematic methods to contact enslaved people once they had a better sense of the lay of the land. So Lieutenant Edward Dickerson, who's a 33-year-old Wisconsin merchant, and he wore a beard that was so long it touched his belt. He escaped from Camp Sorghum and headed towards Georgia. And 4 nights later, he and his companion had observed that enslaved men made darkness the mask for their nightly movements, that they would leave their own living area and either enter the woods to forage and hunt or to go and visit their wives and family members on another plantation. So once they realized about this nighttime movement of enslaved men, what they would do is hide in the woods, and when a man came into the woods, they would jump him and grab him and say, "Help us." And that was how they decided to contact enslaved people. So once this initial contact was made, ingrained assumptions about white supremacy governed their initial encounters with enslaved people in South Carolina. So the first slave that Hadley, that Indianian that we're following, the first enslaved person that they met on the road, Hadley was just very confident we can get help because, as he puts it in his diary and then later narrative, they believed everything we said. Because we were white people, they did what we asked. It made him, feel secure to think that enslaved people were loyal and controllable by white people. So that element of his preconceived assumptions doesn't change. But something does change for Hadley and his party. When they get help, they actually get taken back to an enslaved person's quarters. And there's a group of enslaved people, and so they sit down to eat and they start having a conversation. And Hadley is shocked. These people know about the Emancipation Proclamation. They know about specific policies that Abraham Lincoln has implemented during the Civil War. They understand the political origins of the rebellion. And Hadley says, I just couldn't believe how politically knowledgeable they were and how much they knew. And then as they continue talking, a small door opens in Hadley's closed mind. As they're talking, he's like, they know every white person and every black person who lives in a 60-mile radius from this cabin. They know the geography. They know the terrain. They know everything. So they say, you know what? You tell us where to go. So Hadley's party decides to submit their dispute to the enslaved people that they have met. And they said, where should we go? And the answer they got was, you need to go to Knoxville. The swamps are too bad in Georgia. Everyone who tries to go through the swamps can't make it. We've heard our masters talk about Tories, which are loyal Unionists. So we really do believe it's true that there are Unionists in those North Carolina mountains. So you should go that way. And Hadley says, once they told us what to do, that's what we did. Sitting there in that enslaved cabin, Hadley realized the deep knowledge that enslaved people possessed about their environment and the people around them. So I think it's interesting, I just want to pause and say this, because despite their racist assumptions and despite some distorted perception, these Union soldiers discovered some truths about Southern slaves that historians and linguists would not rediscover until the end of the 20th and the early 21st century. Because scholars who study slavery now assert what these fugitives carefully described in their diary. Enslaved people were mobile. They carved out neighborhoods for activity that crossed plantation boundaries, and they possessed extensive communication networks across space. So the Federals are going to realize more than they thought they would when they started their journey. And what they realized is that it was the black people in the South who were the true loyalists, the true people that could be trusted. Fugitives over and over, they write this in their accounts. We could not have got along without them. They were the true friends to us. For the rest of their lives, these escaped prisoners would write about black Southerners as the people who saved their lives. We trusted over 100 and were not betrayed. One fugitive wrote later, we could not have got along without them. So because these escaped prisoners had to be so observant, through their accounts, we see how enslaved people resisted the Confederacy and how they escalated their resistance. Because why would enslaved people help John V. Hadley after he gave them that ridiculous speech? Because they recognized that helping escaped Yankee prisoners was helping to bring down the Confederacy. They were already resisting slavery. This gave them the opportunity to escalate their resistance and escalate the collapse of the Confederacy in this region. Slaves always tried to assess the military situation during the war and acted for freedom when signs were favorable for success. And slaves in South Carolina realized that something was seriously going wrong for the Confederacy, or it would not have lost 2,800, 3,000 Yankee prisoners. So when the first Federals escaped in October, individual enslaved people provided food, shelter, and guidance, but very quickly the aid became more organized. In the low and mid-country of South Carolina, where slavery was already destabilized, slaves formed military companies in the wake of so many fugitive Federals moving through their area. In the records of the governor of South Carolina, he has to order the state militia to St. Matthew's Parish in November of 1864 to put down what he says is an organized and armed rebellion of mounted slaves. Along the upcountry route, We can follow the transition that slaves made from October to December as the number of escaped prisoners moving across the landscape increased. Aid to prisoners became more organized, utilizing the slaves' family and community networks across plantations and their knowledge of trails in woods and swamps. So, for example, when Hannibal Johnson of the 3rd Maine escaped in late November, slave guides took him from station to station in northwest South Carolina. Over the course of 8 nights in that section of his journey, he was handed off between 13 different guides who took him to prearranged stops and prearranged hiding places along the route. His guides gave him the code name Birdie. We also see enslaved people in the upcountry South Carolina forming organized units to protect escape parties. So when the townspeople of Jalapa, South Carolina, formed a picket on the road in order to intercept escaped Yankee prisoners, enslaved people formed a counter picket on the road a little bit further away so that they could intercept fugitives and tell them, there's a picket waiting to capture you. So they would intercept them and then guide them around the picket that their masters had created. So once the prisoners who are moving to Knoxville get through upcountry South Carolina, they enter a region of the Confederacy, North Carolina, Western North Carolina, and East Tennessee, where white Unionists battled their rebel neighbors and the Confederate Home Guards. So these escaped prisoners enter a portion of the Confederacy where the home front has collapsed, where supporters of the Union, supporters of the Confederacy battle each other in their homes and in their neighborhoods. And women and children are a vital part of this. So escaped prisoners have to navigate this dangerous region by making alliances with guerrillas and outlaws, deciding when to lie, when to fly, and when to fight. So here's a map of the region that they are going to be entering, Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee. So the difficult part for escaped prisoners in this part of the journey is they have to assess the loyalty of people they meet. Is this white person that I meet a Confederate? Is this white person that I meet a Unionist? So they have to practice deception and quickly assess people. So the experience of J. Madison Drake, who's a lieutenant in the 9th New Jersey, he escaped from the train between Charleston and Columbia. His experience is typical. So his escape party, by this point, has crossed in November. They've crossed into North Carolina. They are carrying clubs that they fashioned out of logs and sticks from the trees, because at this point, they're constantly having to fight off dogs, because that's another thing I learned in this book, is that dogs are everywhere in the South. So escaped prisoners have to fight dogs off constantly that charge at them from the farms. So they see a man coming that they think is black. So they approach him to say, help us, and then they realize he's white. Okay, again, going back to their difficulty navigating this world that they didn't understand very well. So there's 4 armed Yankees. They approach this man. He pulls out a pistol. So now they're staring at each other. 4 escaped Yankees with a club, a white Southerner with a pistol. But there's something about the way they're looking at each other that these Yankees start to think, I think he would have shot us by now. So he may be a Unionist, but how do we find out? So one of the people in the party, his name was Harry Todd. Even though he was from New Jersey, he could mimic a Southern accent, and he's a bold and accomplished liar. So he says a lie about who they are. And so the man kind of looks at him, and I love this because the dance that they enter into here is very typical for what happens with escaped prisoners. So the man says, this war's terrible. And going back to what Pete Carmichael talked about, that's not an uncommon thing to say at this point in the war. And so Todd says, oh yes, this war is terrible. And then the guy says, I think it's being mismanaged in Richmond. But that's a safe statement, because you could still be loyal to the Confederacy but criticize Jefferson Davis and his policies. So then Harry Todd says, I don't think there's any government that is worse. Right? So he's trying to escalate the level of commitment, trying to get this other person to say, I don't think any government is worse. And the man says, oh yes. And then finally Drake says, okay, one of us has to risk something that crosses the line. And he says, we're escaped Yankee prisoners. And the guy says, oh, come to my house and get some food. Okay. So the man feeds them. And then Drake's party moves on. And as they are walking on after they get food at this man's house, they come across a woman and her sons cutting some grass, some sorghum grass. Her name was Mary Estes. And Drake's party walks up to her, and before he can say anything, Mary Estes says, "I'm not afraid of you." So she's going to say this to any man who approaches her. She says, "I'm not afraid of you, be you Yankee or rebel, for I can by lifting my hand have you killed where you are now standing. A dozen true rifles are at this very instant leveled upon you." She announced that she hated the Confederacy, that her husband was a deserter, that he was one of the men in the woods bearing their rifles down on the party. And she says, "Now, again, I'm not afraid of you. Who are you?" So Drake produces his commission and his diary that shows that he's an escaped Union prisoner. So Mary Estes shakes his hand, and then she waved a white handkerchief over her head 3 times. And at that signal, more than 20 men dressed in full Confederate uniform and carrying rifles descended from the mountains. From that point until the end of their journey, Drake and his companions were hidden, fed, and eventually guided to Knoxville by a network of families who fought against the Confederate state and its supporters in their communities. Some of these families engaged in guerrilla warfare, but all of them protected with violence the men who were deserters or draft dodgers from the Confederate Army. And these families ultimately used their knowledge and their resources to aid literally thousands of escaped Union prisoners seeking to return to their units and continue the fight against the Confederacy. So escaped prisoner Charles Porter Maddox, an aristocratic officer from Maine, was hidden by the Loftus family in Brevard, North Carolina. This family and its extended kin network raided rebel neighbors for beef, armed every boy in the family over 12 years old, and posted pickets in the road 24 hours a day. Women took the day shift, men took the night shift. When rebel neighbors or state troops would attack the house, the family bolted the door, and the women loaded weapons and handed them to the men who fired them through holes that they had notched in the walls of the house. A shootout that occurred right before Maddox and his party arrived in Brevard had left 7 dead rebels in the yard. So it's interesting to me because women and children are the supply line for the guerrillas fighting rebels in the Carolinas and Tennessee. Women provided food, clothing, carried messages, gave intelligence. And families did not hesitate to employ their children. So what was fascinating to me in this research, there was one escaped party of Yankees that an 11 and a 13-year-old brothers, a family sent these 2 boys alone with 10 escaped Yankee prisoners at night for the boys to guide these escaped prisoners over a mountain. One escape party encountered Melvina Stevens, a 16-year-old girl in East Tennessee. On horseback, she guided a party of 70 men around the pickets of rebel guerrillas and the houses of those who supported them. And she rode alone over a bridge to reconnoiter and discover whether guerrillas were posted on the other side, while the men hid in hiding and waited for her to come back. The escaped Yankees dubbed her the Nameless Heroine, and in fact, they would never release her name until 20 to 25 years after the war because they were worried about reprisals against her. So these escaped Yankees ultimately allied with literally thousands of deserters and recruits for the Union Army that were being recruited in western North Carolina, the upcountry part of South Carolina, upper Georgia, and then also East Tennessee. What I found to be fascinating is that most of the escaped prisoners who head either towards Augusta or up towards Knoxville, they end up arriving back in Union lines, usually with about 70 people, because they've picked up so many deserters from the Confederate Army and recruits for the Union Army from this region. So this is a photograph that was taken. There's 4 Yankees in that picture, but there's also Confederate deserters and a 14-year-old boy in that picture. And this was taken right after they got back to Knoxville. And the other thing that I think is fascinating is that occasionally Union soldiers they would pause this escape journey to actually fight with some of these guerrillas and deserters. So Isaiah Conley, who was in the 101st Pennsylvania, he actually paused his journey to form a skirmish line with some deserters to engage in action against the North Carolina Home Guard. And then there was another party of escaped federal prisoners who met a bunch of Confederate deserters at a famous rock that was kind of a rallying point in North Carolina for Union supporters. They gathered together and then they skirmished through the county of North Carolina, for that particular county, before they continued on the rest of their journey. So I think the escape of thousands of these soldiers reveals how the soldiers' war shaped these northern men. They had become veterans who understood how to apply military discipline to situations that they faced off the battlefield. They had become more mentally flexible. If unable to overcome their belief in white supremacy, they were able to penetrate through their pre-war stereotypes and come to some new understanding about the enslaved black people that they met who were resisting the Confederacy. They were soldiers who could form military alliances with women and children when they came into areas where the home front didn't exist. And they were soldiers who, for the rest of their lives, remembered that their own heroism was bound up in the heroism of others. Thank you. So are there questions? Yes.
Oh, now this will augment it. Two questions come to mind. One, how were these escapees dressed? Were they in uniform? Was there any way of telling them that they had been in the Union Army? And two, what you've told us about these escapees being handed off from one guide to another, were these any of these routes that had been used by the Underground Railroad?
Okay, two very good questions. Let me address the first one. By this point, the officers and the enlisted men, most of them had been in Confederate prisons for 14 to 18 months. So they were not in Union uniform. Their uniforms had basically disintegrated by this point. So what's interesting, some of them are actually in Confederate uniform because they'd been able to trade with guards to get clothes. Some of them are in like a hodgepodge of clothes that look weird and have like holes in them. So one of the things that's interesting is when they get to Western North Carolina, I mean, people are giving them clothes, giving them shoes, because their clothes are in various states. J. Madison Drake, he doesn't have shoes. And so he does that whole journey shoeless, and he almost has to have his feet amputated when he actually gets back to Union lines. The women in his neighborhood in New Jersey spend 3 months alternating shifts, putting bandages on his feet to keep his feet from having to be amputated. So they're in a variety of different types of outfits. So it's interesting because, to your question about the Underground Railroad, there was a director of the Underground Railroad Museum in Ohio who kind of wondered, he'd heard a little bit about the story, and he kind of wondered if this could give information about some of the Underground Railroad routes. But I don't think that it necessarily does, because a lot of enslaved people in South Carolina, when they escape, a lot of their history is going south to Florida, not going north. And it seems to me that the way that kind of the routes unfold over the course of the 6 weeks when prisoners first started escaping, and it seems to me that enslaved people kind of develop new routes that they're using. They kind of are taking into account changed circumstances of where Confederate reserves are posted and things like that. So I don't actually think it lines up. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Picking up on that question there, did you find in your research, looking at those who were trying to, who were the home guards who were trying to track down, if they identified a particular look, if there was a way that they described the escaped prisoners and how you might be able to pick them out from a crowd?
Yeah, so it's great because Drake's party, at one point, they run into a colonel in the North Carolina Home Guard. And they approach him, and Todd tries to walk up and do the Southern accent thing again. And this guy just looks at him and he said, "I know who you are. I've been in the Army. I know who you are." That's the other thing. People do have more regional looks, I think, in some senses. So it's not that hard for I think for most Southerners to go, you're not from Georgia. You know, they can tell a Massachusetts guy. But what's interesting is most of these escape parties have at least one legitimate Southerner with them, which is part of why they can kind of try to blend in a little more at times, because a lot of prisoners in these prisons are people from Tennessee, Kentucky, Northern Virginia, and places like that. So a lot of parties, but I think the main thing is people can tell they're escaped prisoners because they look horrible. So, I mean, the real answer to your question is they're emaciated, their clothes are falling apart, they look horrible. So it depends, you know, there's some parties that their state of clothing is in a good enough condition that they can try to be conscripts who are going home on furlough from the Confederate Army. That's usually the story they try, if they try a story. And that seems to be believed sometimes, but most of the time it's not believed because it's obvious just looking at them. They were in a prison somewhere for 18 months.
You mentioned that when the escaping prisoners had to authenticate that they were indeed Union soldiers, he produced a diary and he produced his commission papers.
Yes.
So I'm very curious, why would prisoners have those things? Was there no program of confiscation when they went into prison? Curious to me, because it seems to me that those types of documents are going to maintain a higher level of morale than
Right.
if they're taken away from you.
So, very good question. And the answer is the difference in how officers are treated and how enlisted men are treated on both sides in the Civil War. So, officers get privileges. So, the escaped prisoners that I talk about in the book who are enlisted men from Andersonville and Florence, they don't have that kind of stuff because their stuff got taken from them. But officers, you know, they're supposed to be gentlemen. They're supposed to be treated, even in the mid-19th century. The Articles of War treat officers and enlisted men differently. The assumptions about your social status are different. And so the answer is the officers who escape, a lot of them have cash on them. A lot of them have diaries and pencils. So it's just a product that they were officers. I can hear you.
One place in archives where you found a bunch of stuff, or did you have to go do a lot of things?
So I went through a lot of so how it happened was that for the previous book, The Gentleman and the Roughs, I had been reading Charlie Porter Maddox's diary, because he was a guy who liked to beat up his enlisted men, and I was interested in that. So I was reading his diary for that, and I'm reading he gets captured, and then I'm reading his time in prison camp, and then I'm reading his escape, and then he's talking about there's so many other escaped people on the road, and then he's having a dinner with an enslaved person and talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, and I'm like, what is this? So I went to the National Archives, and I found a document that the federal clerks had put together that had a list of more than 3,000 men who had escaped from Confederate prisons in this list, and it showed where they were captured, where they escaped, and where they returned to Union lines. So that document fascinated me, and that said, okay, I think there's an actual book in this. And then I spent tons of time in archives in South Carolina, North Carolina, and East Tennessee, because a lot of the story can be pieced together from state records, because the state militia and the state guards are deployed to try to track down all these escaped prisoners. So I was able to find out a lot from local state records that helped me piece together other parts of the story. And then also provost marshal records for the Union Army, because when these guys returned, they get interviewed. What did you see inside the South? Where were there Confederate troops? You know, and so I got a lot of information from that.
How did they get away from the colonel of the Home Guard who recognized that they were Yankee prisoners and then have
They got away because he said, have fun, go ahead. So that was the other thing that was interesting. I tried to back up everything I read. You know, you can't take somebody's, even if it's a diary, you can't necessarily take it at face value. So I follow 4 escape parties in the book, and every party that I picked, I was able to document other parts of their story with other sources. So one of the things that I did is I looked through the North Carolina militia, state guard, adjutant general records for the state, and I was able to find people who were court-martialed for disloyalty and link them up with some of the people that Drake and others talked about in their diaries. So the answer is there were some really disloyal people in the North Carolina state troops.
So have you given any thought as to why, when the Jim Crow era took hold, these families who helped escaped Union prisoners were so easily overwhelmed?
You know, I have given it, I think the most simple answer is just the unification around white supremacy. In other words, these loyalist families that help these escaped prisoners, they don't like the Confederacy, they didn't like secession, but they do believe in white supremacy. And so when that is challenged, they're going to fall in line. Even though some of them don't. At the end of the book, I talk about Drake and Mary Estes. They reconnect at the end of their lives. And, her ambivalence towards the South, I think, is clear even to the end of her life. Or towards the Confederacy, I apologize. But I think, for her whole family was devastated. Her whole experience was so devastating. For her, the war is this terrible time, and she wants to put it behind her any way she can. And if moving on through just kind of acceding to what is unfolding during Jim Crow, she just wants to put that all behind her.
Great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm curious about this experience and how it affected these escapees later in life. And did they go back to this area, any of them? Were they involved in any Reconstruction activities? Did they take on political offices that would help in the Reconstruction politics that took place?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question. One escaped prisoner, when he returns to Union lines, he makes sure that he is one of the people that is appointed to occupation duty in South Carolina, and that he's in charge of writing the contracts between masters and formerly enslaved people. And he wrote, "I was hated everywhere in South Carolina because I wrote the most generous contracts that I could write for black people, because that was the only way I could thank them for what they had done for me." Most escaped prisoners who are officers, when they write their accounts later in the I used a lot of diaries and accounts from right at the time, but for those who write in the 1870s, they have one message in their books that they're writing during Reconstruction and during the politics of Reconstruction. Black people were our true friends. They were our true friends. We have to reward them. They never waver from that narrative for the rest of their lives, because unlike, a lot of Union soldiers don't waver from that narrative, but for these escaped prisoners, they know that the fact that they're alive is because of black people in the South who saved them and helped them. And so they want that message. They have to be protected. Their rights have to be protected. So they write stories that highlight the heroism. They're stories that have a lot of racist elements in it. I can't say, they all believed that black people should have the right to vote, but they certainly believe that black people should be protected. So John V. Hadley goes on to be a state legislator, and he is a huge Republican who supports the Republican Reconstruction Plan. I'll also throw in, kind of setting up for Jonathan's talk later, these guys also struggle for the rest of their life with physical problems. Their time in prison, for most of them, affected their stomachs for the rest of their lives. A lot of them say, I never could eat normally again. And then their journey walking across the Appalachian Mountains in December, a lot of them have problems with their feet for the rest of their lives as well. Did I answer every part of your question? Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Foote, we've got 2 questions from our virtual audience, and I'll try to do this lightning round style since I know we're running out of time. Robert Sneeden was imprisoned at Andersonville and writes of his release in his diary. Is this incident that you were talking about, is this mentioned at all in his diary?
Which incident?
I'm not quite sure. The question isn't quite clear. So Bill, if you can put that in the chat, that would be helpful.
So diarists like Sneeden, they do talk about the transfer to Savannah and Charleston and Florence. I mean, that's documented by a lot of enlisted men prisoners. And there's not a lot of escapees from actually Andersonville. It's during this transfer and then that initial phase in Florence. And then there's a big, massive escape that occurs in February 1865 when the Confederacy has to evacuate South Carolina because of Sherman, and they try to get the prisoners up into Wilmington where they're actually going to exchange them. And I mean, that's where a huge another bulk of, big escapes occur. And a lot of diarists like Sneeden record those kind of escapes in their diary, yes.
Great, thank you. And the second question is, what books do you yet seek to write?
What books do I what?
Do you still want to write?
What books do I still want to write? So I just wrote one that I wanted to write, which is Rites of Retaliation, about civilization, soldiers, and campaigns, but I'll move on to the one that I want to write next. So my reading of these diaries and my discovery of the level of dogness in South Carolina, how many dogs there were, how dogs were used to police enslaved. I saw so many petitions from overseers saying dogs are all we have left to police enslaved people. Dogs are the best tool that we have. And I found that very fascinating. So what I'm writing now is a book called Honor and Dogs, Warrior Cultures in 19th Century North America. And I use dogs to look at Seminole warriors, U.S. Army officers, and Pawnee warriors, and their honor cultures and how their warfare incorporates animals. So that's.
All right, everyone join me in thanking Dr. Foote for her wonderful talk.